Uh, Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us RILCA Talk today, and welcome people who join us online via Zoom also. For the open sessions, I would like to invite Assistant Professor Dr. Sunida Siwaprathomchai, Deputy Director for Corporate Communication and Academic Services, to open the sessions.
Thank you, Dr. Pimara. On behalf of the Research Institute for Languages and Cultures of Asia, Mahidol University, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. Thank you for joining us. And it is our honor to host this session in collaboration with SIL International as a part of our ongoing partnership to create academic exchange and research under the framework of our mutual agreement. Today's topic is school language mapping, gathering and interpreting data to guide multilingual education program. This highlights the importance of MLE or multicultural education in creating inclusive learning atmosphere, especially for children from diverse linguistic backgrounds. I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the speaker, Dr. Maik Gibson, professor from Moorlands College and international sociolinguistic coordinator for SIL Global. We are so privileged to have him share his expertise with us today, drawing on his extensive experience on language survey, conducting research on and language survey, and working with organizations like ASIAD, right? SIL Global and World Bank as well. Finally, I would like to thank everyone here, both online and on site, for joining us. Your participation is what makes gathering like this meaningful and impactful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sunida. And furthermore, I would like to introduce our special guest today. Dr. Sunida already mentioned some things about his extensive experience. Today, our speaker is Dr. Maik Gibson. He is the International Sociolinguistics Coordinator and Senior Sociolinguistic Consultant at the SIL Internationals. And he also a sociolinguistic lecturer at Moorlands College in the UK, and has a computer speech and language processing background from Cambridge University. Dr. Gibson covered language shifts, policy planning, language change and development. He is also interested in how digital media tie into sociolinguistics. Over his career, he has taught 12 institutions across 5 countries and spent 6 years teaching at Africa International University at Nairobi at Kenya. And today he is going to discuss in the topic school language mapping, gathering and interpreting data to guide multilingual education MLE program. Please welcome Dr. Maik.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here. I will be presenting about my experience, which all of these 3 studies I'll be looking at are from Africa. And I'm aware that many things are quite different in Asia. So if you can bear in mind when I am talking, what similarities do you see and what differences do you see? You know, what is applicable? There are probably some things which some issues I'm talking about which probably don't apply here as well. But I'll leave that decision up to you. Thank you again. It is a privilege, and I'm looking forward to interacting with you. Please, if something's not clear or I have a strain, well, I can't change my accent, but if if there are any sort of quick questions, please feel free to stop me in the middle. Okay. So yes, the topic is really about how do we gather appropriate, particularly language-related data to support multilingual education programs. That's the key question. And I'm going to go through that by looking at 3 case studies in particular, where actually the goals of the multilingual education programs were different. In fact, in one of the cases, they probably wouldn't have even used that term. And then the methodologies, which were negotiated between myself as the consultant and the client, were also different, partially because the purposes were different, and also partially because in some particular situations, the client did want to do a certain type of research or didn't. So I'm not going to spend much on this point, because I think in this company, this is agreed, and you've probably heard many talks, but that multilingual education is an important tool for creating equitable education for children from ethnic minority and migrant groups. Now, in Africa, it's as if everybody's, in most contexts, is a minority. Most of the children in school will be being taught in a language which isn't theirs, and that's the context for all of these places where I've worked. And they might well be from a big group, but they're still not using their own language in education generally, or haven't been. So I think we hopefully all agree that good research, good data is necessary for good planning. That's the thing here. So that's Madagascar on the right. Well, people do say Mada for short, so that still works. And we have the Gambia. You see, it's Africa, continental Africa's smallest country. So I've got an arrow pointing to it. You see the little red sliver there inside Senegal. And then the DR, what I'll be referring to as the DRC. So those are the 3 countries that we'll be talking about in particular. So the plan, and I'll give the context as we go through each case study, the plan for MLE was a bit different in each country. But as I just said, most people, and not just members of minorities, have to deal with different language varieties in daily life. They are multilingual societies. Now it varies from one place and even within countries, but a very common profile in many parts of Africa is that people will be using 3 different languages on a daily basis. Often, so my time living in Kenya, that would be English for formal purposes, Swahili for general chit-chat, informal economy, and then one of the many what Kenyans refer to as mother tongues or ethnic-based languages like Kikuyu and Luo and Kikamba. And people will be regularly using all 3 every day. So one of the principles of this research is we don't just treat people as if they are monolingual. We don't just say, you're a speaker of this language or you're a speaker of that language. We look at the whole repertoire. Now that is actually more challenging than identifying a dominant language, and sometimes levels of ability in those languages vary. And that's a trickier thing to measure than which is the language which is preferred in a particular domain. So that's one key principle underlying all 3 studies. We're not just looking at competence in one language. Well, one of the studies we more or less are, but but that's where I think it's important to try and look at the whole repertoire. And particularly we're looking at children and at teachers here in these studies. So first, here's a map of the Gambia. And the little pins are almost every single primary school in the country and the dominant language in it. You will see a big mix of colors. which is a fascinating place which becomes difficult to say. You know, it's not like Wolof is spoken in the West and Mandinka in the East. They're all mixed up with some geographical patterns of spread. This program was very much initiated by the Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education. And that was a particular, supported by the World Bank, a particular joy for me, actually, because the research had been you knew what they wanted. The people in the ministry knew what they wanted to know. And that was being driven by local concerns. So what is the policy environment? One interesting thing when I was in the Gambia, if I said the word policy, people would say, but there isn't a policy, because there was no officially agreed policy. Of course, there was a sort of de facto policy because people did things and there were materials provided and so on. And actually this study has fed into formal policy discussions, which I believe are actually going on continuing this week. This study was done in 2023. And the environment was they're open to using one of the 5 to 7 national languages. Those are the non-English languages spoken in the country. There are more languages, but these are the ones which are stronger. And one thing which was underlined, and I'll show you a picture of Mr. Zheng in a moment, was there was a big focus on the languages which are best understood, rather than the languages which reflect ethnic identity. And those two things, and that's something I'll be talking about, often get a little bit mixed up together, but that was his terminology. And just here is some terminology. National language is a slippery term. It means different things in different countries. In the Gambia, it's any indigenous language, but not English, which is the official language. The equivalent term in French, langue nationale, in the DRC means one of 4 particular African languages recognized in the Constitution, but the official language is French. And then if you go to Cameroon, it's all the languages of the country. It's in French as well. So it's one of those things to watch out for. So, oh, you can't really see the picture of Mr. Zheng there. There he is. I'll just leave that down there. Apart from the school sign says you must only speak English. But when I went to that school, they very much weren't. And his primary concern is our children are not doing well in school. So it's driven from a success rather than, well, I suppose success is an ideology, but it was more to do with that rather than colonial concerns and so on. Up till 2011, children were being taught to read only in English. And I personally, having lived in Kenya, was surprised at actually the fact that English seemed to have less of a role in the Gambia than it did, say, in Kenya. So most children didn't arrive at school speaking English, presenting multiple challenges for learning to read. Now, since 2011, there's been a program of using 1 hour a day of teaching reading in national languages, not implemented in all schools. I think in many schools it actually was tried and then withdrawn. But that was, I can't say policy because people don't like that word, but that was the practice, and difficult to say quite how many schools were still trying to do it. So it's a complicated thing. Mr. Zheng actually expressed the wish. He'd visited Kenya. He said, I wish we had a Swahili, which everyone can speak. But Mandinka and Wolof, also known as Wolof, are widely known, but you would meet people that didn't know one or didn't know the other. Normally, people ended up being able to talk, but the choice of language was negotiated. I would hear both Mandinka and Wolof in the capital. Many people would speak both, and then perhaps another language or two. So the phrase that Mr. Zheng himself used was that teaching them in the language they are comfortable in. And he was actively against the term mother tongue. because he said, then people will think, well, I am Fula, so my children should be taught in Fula even if they don't speak it. And one of the interesting things with Gambia is ethnicity and language often didn't match. People would say, oh, I'm from a Jola family, but I speak Mandinka. And that complicates when you have a mother tongue. People will understand different things. And I think it's quite clear that sometimes it was understood in different ways. So a school that I visited while sort of testing out the questionnaire here had signs which were no longer really being used. This school had stopped the program. Let's just move that over there. But they had Olaf class and Mandinka class. And here's a question. What do you do? Do you try to use one language per school? Or do you split the children up into different groups speaking different languages? Use as many languages as possible or as few. And there are practical issues. There are all sorts of issues. What are your values in this situation? Do you want as many, I mean, my values would be we want as many children to have as good an experience of education as possible. But how that gets quantified, what does that mean when you have 10% of children who are stronger in another language than another as against the other 90? What do you do? It's complicated and implementation will be variable. Here's a quote from a teacher in I think it was that same school where the pictures were taken from, who had been teaching the language children in Jola, but she said, I find it difficult as the pupils are also not very used to the local language. And that was a case where many of the Jola didn't actually speak it, but someone had gone through the lists and gone by the surnames and had put the children on the Jola class. So it wasn't actually, they weren't actually being taught in the language that they spoke the best in this case. And the teacher was saying it's actually a challenge to do so. He had some that spoke it very well and others that didn't. And that was what the research was for. They said, we don't know which are the most spoken languages in the schools around the country. And if you remember the map that I showed you, and I'll show another map in a moment, you can understand why. There you go. There's the heat map of where we find the 3 biggest languages. And the distribution, apart from Olaf is not really present in the extreme east, is quite similar. And you know, I as a sociolinguist who's got quite a few experiences of Africa, I've never seen quite this pattern anywhere else. So that's our research findings. So the question of how come people don't know, because it's really complicated. So how did we go about this? My primary tool was just go and listen to the children and what they're speaking to each other in the playground, because that will show the language which they probably speak the best amongst themselves. It might well be that they have different languages at home, but that's the language which they're working out. You know, how to, the concept of a speech community, is the school a speech community where people have shared norms and so on. I think the finding was many are, but many aren't as well. We also, rather than going on self-reported behavior, which language do you speak? Because that often can reflect, that's my ethnic identity, that's the language I speak. We did actually ask those questions as well. We asked, because the researchers went into classrooms and they asked the children to raise their hands. You know, if the enumerators could do so, they would say in Mandinka, who can speak Mandinka, who can speak Wolof, and there's like, now of course they couldn't speak all the languages, but they would normally speak about 3. We also did classroom observation, some interviews with children, parents, teachers, and head teachers. And we also tried some comprehension testing of children in 2 languages. So we chose the language which we'd observed as being the most used. And if the child said, I actually prefer another language, we had a very simple stories, and they only had to answer 3 questions. It wasn't rigorous comprehension testing, but it helped as part of building up a broader picture. And generally, when we looked at the different types of data, we tended to get the same picture, which I think beefed up the recommendations. The least accurate data was from head teachers. They would quite often get it wrong. It was interesting because they're mainly probably facing the teachers and not really as concerned. And they were also the people, when I was at the school where there was a sign saying only speak English, I drilled the head teacher about that one. And she ended up saying, well, it's only really when they speak to me, and it's only really grade 5 and grade 6, because the younger ones can't. So, yeah, so people would often say, oh, the policy is only to speak English, but you could see this was a stated policy rather than a practiced one. One issue that often occurs, and I asked, I think, when I was looking around earlier, what's the difference between Malayu and Patani Malay? And it was just, oh, some people called it, was the same thing. That issue actually in the Gambia wasn't a big one, but it can be an issue that people use different labels for what are very similar linguistic varieties. But there were some significant dialectal differences, particularly within Pular. That's people might not have heard of the Fulani, but that wasn't something that the ministry wanted us to collect data on. They didn't want us to drill down into dialect issues, and so we didn't. And it's also quite challenging to do. You need to put a lot more resources into your research to do good dialect research. We recorded in, comments from teachers when we heard them. And we looked at teachers, I won't go into, and their repertoires as well. For Mandinka and Wolof, the two biggest languages, generally almost all teachers spoke them. But we did, I mean, I spoke to one teacher. I wasn't doing most of the research, but those are the examples I remember best. She had a classroom which was dominant in Wolof. She said, I don't speak Wolof. I say something in Mandinka and I get children translate into Wolof for me. That wasn't very common for those two big languages. But for smaller languages, that was quite common, and particularly the Sarahule, who were, I think, the 5th biggest group, mainly in the east of the country. We came across schools where none of the teachers could speak it, and this was the part of the country where the multilingualism was the least. Often the children were monolingual. I wonder what they are doing and how they are managing. And it doesn't seem there are many teachers who speak Sarahule. I think we all know sometimes some communities adopt education more than others, and those that do end up with lots of teachers. So identified that as a particular issue for the ministry to address among that community. That issue did also exist in Pular-speaking schools. Maybe 20 to 30% of teachers didn't really speak the language. But generally, some of the children did speak other languages. But obviously, getting children to translate for you is not the ideal solution. Now, my own expectation going into this, based on my experience in DRC, was that the vast majority of schools would have one language which dominated. And at DRC, it was more than 95%. We ended up, and we were kind of encouraged to try to recommend just one language per school. But in 27% of schools, actually, we said, and our criterion, I think it's on the next slide, was that if at least 20% of the children don't really speak the main language well, then we would recommend that language be used in teaching as well, as if possible. That's a slightly arbitrary, figure, but our feeling was probably if it was less than that, those children would probably learn the major language quite quickly. But if it was more than that, they wouldn't need to. Some of the scenarios seemed to be a school which was bringing children from different villages, and the different villages had different languages, and they would probably stick together and not necessarily learn each other's languages. You would always find children that did, but you would find children that didn't as well. So, and I think the ministry wanted us to find fewer than that. And in fact, in a few schools, about 6 schools, we said, you really need to be teaching in 3. Here's a chart of where you find the languages. And there on the right, you see that the top 3 languages, Mandinka, Wolof, and Pular, account for 90% of the schools. So in policy decisions, what do? Do you develop 3 languages for 90%? But the next 2 languages added another 8%. So now you have 98% of schools covered by 5 languages. And that seems to be the decision that was made by the ministry. I didn't say you should do that. But we did also look in more detail at levels of bilingualism in those 3 other languages. Serer and Manjaku have been used in schools already. Bambara, you might well recognize as the national language of Mali, and wasn't on the list, but we found 3 schools where that was the dominant language. It is actually, I don't know how close related it is related to Mandinka, but we found very high levels of bilingualism in those schools that among the Serer, almost everybody could speak Wolof, apart from in one of the schools. Manjaku, only 2 schools, but interestingly, you would find Manjaku teachers all over the country, a group that had really gone for education. So quite vocal as well about the rights for their language. And then Bambara, this was news to everybody. No one expected to find schools where Bambara was the dominant language. And I think there was some reticence about using it because it wouldn't be seen as an indigenous Gambian language. So this is the form the recommendations took, the report, which I think was in, will be linked to in a moment, gives recommendations for all 617 schools. And this is how we did it. We've got the name of the school, you've got its GPS coordinates. Every school has a recommended language. And then in cases where, it's in the way, isn't it? Where at least 20% of the children didn't understand that language, we would make a second recommendation. So that's the case with the middle one there. But if you look, once I move this out of the way, at the top one, most children also speak Pular. This was not that common, but we did find it. We didn't actually make a Pular recommendation because we found that basically all the children could speak Mandinka, and that would work. But we thought we'll put that information there. If there's a local move and people say we want to use Pular, then they've got information to back that up. And that could be practical. So that's the criterion. Now, we try to have getting the right level of evidence. So we would be willing to, generally we wanted at least 2 types of evidence to make a recommendation for 2 languages. One of those pieces would we actually observed children using different languages in the playground. And the dynamics were complicated. And early on when we were piloting this, we would have a group of 4 or 5 children, this was in the capital, were coming in speaking Mandinka. Another child joined them and they all switched to Wolof, because that child obviously didn't speak Mandinka and Wolof was the main language of the school. We did find that teachers' comments about what language they needed to use to explain concepts to children were pretty accurate. You know, it's not surprising teachers know what's going on. They would often say, we need to talk in this language and it also needs explaining in this language. There were some teachers who just were really good teachers and who would do things in 3 languages and would say, how do you say this in your language and so on. We observed this. That probably wasn't typical, but you know, they were aware, and they would maybe in schools where there were multiple languages, they would maybe make a point in Mandinka. I mean, most actual teaching, most actual conversation in the lower grades was not in English, even where the medium was officially English. It was Mandinka or Wolof or whatever. And sometimes they would get another child to explain in another language and so on. And then we did some comprehension testing and saw if that was consistent, you know, particularly focused on the main language spoken at school. If children just couldn't understand the very simple story, that was also pretty strong evidence that 2 languages should be recommended. Now, this is not my job, but one of the things as a consultant, you need to help people think through, what do you do with this? So how do you deal with a language with a school with multiple languages? Do you split them up into separate classes and they spend their whole day just with other children from the same community or from the same language? It could be easier logistically, but it could also mean, and I was surprised in one school that I visited to find some children who are Pular speaking, who claim not to be able to speak Mandinka or Wolof. when they were growing up in the city and they were in a Pula speaking class? Or do we only separate the children by language when, for those classes where the language of instruction is a national language? More complex logistically, trying to move 6-year-olds from one class to another, I imagine is not the easiest thing. But it also opens up space for multilingualism, for translanguaging, and so on, or using more than one language in the classroom. Is it all right if I just close this because I keep on having to move it? Okay. Sorry if you, well, I don't know, you might be able to see me if you're on Zoom. And can teachers do it as well? Some teachers can. You know, most teachers did speak more than one national language, but as we said, we couldn't predict exactly which ones they would. And then just the principle, even just using one national language is better than using English. And this willingness to, even if you're Jola, to have your child be taught in Mandinka, very high level of intermarriage between communities. Maybe the acceptance of this would be, it seemed to be reasonable acceptance of this. Yes, there were some people that said, no, we want our child to be taught in our language. You know, there's often that language as a subject and language as medium often get mixed up in people's minds. Or people would see this as an opportunity to teach the children the language, or some people might say they don't need to be taught in Mandinka, they already speak it. Not getting the point that that's the bridge to, you know, cognitive expansion and so on. Now, I think generally we found teachers' attitudes towards using national languages positive, much more positive than I was expecting. Part of me wonders if also they've heard that this is policy or being proposed, and therefore it's a good thing. But teachers did say how teaching a child to read in their language would help. This church, that's the wrong word, sorry, child in acquiring literacy skills and transferring those skills to other languages. How does this fit within the whole system? This introduction of national languages hadn't happened in the early curriculum. So, and another issue which I think Carol Benson is talking a lot about at the moment, national languages don't tend to be, and they aren't in the Gambia, formally examined. And so schools, which are, of course, focused on success, would give less emphasis to the national language curriculum. This was not in answer to a direct question. It was, what other needs do you have? 52% of teachers said, I need more training. Some of the teachers had had a few weeks training, some of them had nothing. Parents, a very high number, 91%, said they thought it was good, that they were being taught in national languages. Now, I've seen other countries where you get figures nowhere near this because people say English as the route to success. But anyway, it does look like it's not a significant impediment to implementation of a national language policy. Head teachers, a little less positive. They mentioned more issues, teachers aren't trained, our materials are old, etc. And also this problem of, you know, when you're assigned to a school, no one asks you which languages do you speak, you just go. And that was one of the uses of this research, is hoping in planning new teacher placement, they'll look at the linguistic repertoire of the teacher and see if it matches that of the school. So one thing, there was no training in use of national languages at the Teachers Training College, Gambia College. There has been some in-service training, but it's been patchy. So you can read the full report. If you have the PowerPoint, you can just click on that link there. So now to the second study in the DRC. And the link to the report is there. And we're looking at these provinces, and there are 3 different national languages: Lingala, Chiluba, and Kiswahili. If I say Swahili, it's exactly the same thing. this study was meant to be done in another Chiluba speaking conference, but district, but province, but there was significant conflict going on there, so we didn't do that. So most education is in French. As I've said, 4 other national languages may be used in education. The project had been using 3 of these languages in 8 provinces as part of their investment in education. The program had already started, and they were asking for an sort of a check of, do children speak these languages? How well do they speak them? Because they're wanting to, of course, hoping to find that all the children spoke them. And so what was going on in these schools supported by the project, called Accélère, was in the first 2 grades, they were being taught in the national languages. French was being taught orally rather than as a written language. And there was a lot of teacher training going on. The other 200 languages of DRC are not approved for educational use. I wanted to find out more about the children's full repertoire, but I was told it wasn't really relevant to find about the other languages they spoke. I did still find bits out about that. So another factor that fortunately I was aware of was that the standard variety used in educational materials was often quite different from what people actually spoke. So we tested levels of understanding in both local and standard varieties of the national language. The standard by reading to them, not getting them to read, because then you're also testing their reading ability. But we got the enumerators to learn texts and to say them expressively and ask some questions. That was the standard variety. And then local was just from conversation. And we also wanted to know about attitudes. It's always important to understand the attitudes when doing this, because teachers' attitudes and parents' attitudes will be either things which help the implementation of an MLE program or hinder it. So, basic question is, how much do children know these languages? And what languages do they use at school? Also, teachers, do they know these languages? And what attitudes might get in the way? So again, we were looking at students playing outside and on the school premises. And we hypothesized actually that sometimes the pressure of being in a school might change the language you speak from what you might speak on the street. And we actually had enumerators observe children who were speaking Swahili as they were coming into school, but once they got into school compound spoke French. Now that actually is very rare. It was only in middle-class urban schools you'd have children's French would be of that level. But it just shows the effect of place on language choice. We also did interviews to determine understanding of national language, and teachers to look at their knowledge of these languages and their attitudes towards their use. Now, one thing people wanted to say, well, does this apply to the rest of the country? Well, of course, we will only be able to say this is happening for those parts where we were able to do the study. One of the 2 Lingala provinces, we had to abandon the project. Ebola broke out in the very villages they were visiting at the time. I was quite horrified when I saw the dates and the places they'd been. Fortunately, none of them got ill. But we also discovered that you can't say language patterns in DRC are this way or that way. In Katanga in the south, Swahili was becoming the dominant language, and the mother tongues, so to speak, were being lost in many places. But that was not happening amongst the Mbaka in South Ubangi, in the northwest of the country, where many children were totally monolingual in Mbaka, despite being taught in Lingala and having an official language of French. So here you have results of the observations of children's language, and you see, and basically saying, are they using the national language amongst themselves or not? So have a quick look at that, and you can see where the program is likely to be successful. Kasai Oriental, in both urban and rural contexts, you've got 100% and 95% of children using those languages. In pretty much all urban areas, you've got more than 80%. So actually, one of the things was in urban areas, this is working quite well. You see two rural areas where, well, we don't know. From this, we don't know, because we don't know, just because they're speaking Mbaka or another language doesn't mean they don't know Lingala. It does mean it's not their first language. So that's some interesting data, very different patterns. And just to say, in urban areas, if they're not speaking the national language, they might be speaking French, as I said, quite rare, but that did happen in a few places. And then in rural areas, the alternative is a local language. But also actually in the urban areas of Sudubangi, which I'll be talking about, that's the one province where, to be frank, the policy wasn't working. And when I mentioned this, people said, oh, our EGRA scores are terrible there. We've always wondered why. And the children don't understand the language of instruction. So, but there, the other language in town was the local language rather than French. So here we have the understanding, did the children understand most of the story or not? And you see again, this is slightly puzzling. And we just said that lots of children are speaking Swahili, and yet understanding those four bottom ones, urban and rural, they're in the Swahili speaking area, they're not understanding the story well. What's going on there? And yeah, so let's have a look at the next one. Here we have the local variety, and those bottom four are against Swahili speaking areas. And in urban, everybody can understand the local variety fine, but not the standard variety, because the difference between the standard and the local variety for Swahili is to a point where it obstructs comprehension. That wasn't the case with the other two languages, where the differences were relatively minor. But with Swahili, remember that standard Swahili is based on the dialects of Zanzibar and Mombasa, 1,000 miles away on the Indian Ocean coast in Kenya and Tanzania, not in Congo. And so I speak a bit of Swahili. I was astonished by how different it was down there. So they were speaking Swahili, but not the Swahili that was in the books. And that, as I said, wasn't a particular issue. Now you'll notice there's one place where, well, sorry, the things are in French. Ne parle pas, does not speak. In rural Sudubangi, most of the rural children do not speak Lingala. We had enumerators going in and greeting the children in Lingala, and Lingala just staring at them, not knowing how to respond even to greetings. There were, 22% spoke reasonably well and 25% somewhere in between. So that was the one place where the policy really wasn't working, was the finding. And to some extent, so just comparison there, understanding of the standard variety to the left and the local variety to the right. And you see the big difference in the Swahili speaking bottom four examples. Teachers, however, no problem. Almost all teachers spoke the appropriate local national language. That was something we were able to confirm, because these are languages spoken over a large territory. And you didn't tend to have teachers moving, apart from in the very big towns, from one part of the country to another. DRC is a very big country with very poor infrastructure. So teachers tended to use a local variety rather than a standard variety, but this was mainly a problem, as I've said, in Swahili. Also for the teachers. Teachers say, oh, I don't know what the proper words are. And here we have, for each language, Swahili, Lingala, and Chiluba, the problems. So Chiluba problems are much less. Chiluba is really interesting. Swahili and Lingala have no ethnic identity associated with them. Swahili, as I've said, is from the East African coast. Lingala seems to be originated as a contact language. There aren't there isn't an ethnicity Lingala. There is, but Chiluba is like 4 million people who would see themselves as Luba. And so that area, it's the language of the home and it's the language approved for education. And so you see this, and that's also the levels of understanding. It's really the only case where things are quite so simple in DRC. But teachers, only 30% of teachers said they have problems with variety. And this was, we didn't ask them, do you have problems with vocabulary? This is when they brought it up. 40% of teachers said, oh, I've got problems with the vocabulary when speaking Swahili. So again, more evidence of the big difference in spoken Swahili and the materials used in the in educational materials. Just to say, national languages are much better understood than French. So already a plus to the program. The vast majority of teachers are positive. And actually in all the urban areas studied, the national language is probably the ideal language for teaching because it's the language that students use among themselves. But then a highly variable results in rural areas. 78% of children in rural Sudubangi not having enough Lingala, and then smaller groups in some other areas. Now in Equateur province, where we had to abandon the research, I mean, we got some, you might remember, I doubt it, that we found very few children were speaking Lingala, but they tended to understand it quite well. Their local language was was reasonably closely related to Lingala, and so learning Lingala wasn't very hard. Seems to be the reason that even though they weren't speaking it, Lingala seemed to be working. They tended to have quite good scores when we tested their Lingala. Yeah, and again, that statement about the difference between local and standard being an issue in Swahili-speaking areas. And actually, we can't say that for all of Congo. The differences in the south are bigger than they are up in by Goma, places there where people say, oh, the Swahili is better there. I'm not able to go into detail. So I recommended that actually in Sudubangi, they consider using Mbaka rather than Lingala. And to some extent, using local languages in Lualaba, where around 30% of the children had problems with Swahili. So, and then in Swahili, they should take into account the differences between the spoken Swahili and the standard language in the design of materials. So build bridges, what's similar, and then have practice for things which are different. The first recommendation was rejected by the NGOs because they felt this was against government policy. But one of those, I still felt I had to say it. The local educational authorities said, oh, this is interesting. And they, there was a national organization which was already running about 50 schools providing curriculum, which used Mbaka. They'd been told they weren't allowed to expand, but they could carry on. And after the report, the local authorities said, you can try running it out to another 50 schools. But that was nothing to do with the program that the NGOs were supporting. I did then produce a summary of the key differences between standard and Katanga Swahili. It happens that because I speak Swahili, I was able to do that. If it had been for Chiluba or Lingala, I probably couldn't have done it. And that handed that over to be used in the design of educational materials. I didn't have any involvement in the design of those materials. Okay, final example, Madagascar. In those two provinces of Andrui at the very bottom and Atsimono Atsiananan, which means southeast. And here, a different profile again, and I'm going to use the Malagas or Malgache, however you want to say it, Malagasy Official, which is the standard language. The primary education, despite being a former French colony, is actually in Malgache, and with some introduction of French in preparation for secondary school, which is taught in French. I did have one teacher tell me, no, we teach them in French, but about half the schools in, I spoke to the school principal in French, and they couldn't respond. I just kept on saying merci. They understood that. Now, in the South, it's an interesting case for a linguist. I'm calling them dialects because that's what the government and what society sees them as, but these are not varieties that if you speak them, you can understand Malagasy official. But they are very much considered as dialects by the government. But teachers were if teachers were from elsewhere, most teachers weren't. They said, I don't understand their children, and they don't understand me, especially in rural areas. So no approval for use of anything but standard Malgache and French in the education system. There was one point they tried English as well, but that didn't go down too well. Didn't work because there's not enough, the teachers didn't speak it. So the NGO I was working with were concerned actually about, could even the teachers speak Malgache rather than local varieties? And so that was the focus of this. I asked many times, can't we test the children? They said, no, we don't. We already know that they don't speak it. Now, the majority of teachers have not completed secondary education. Madagascar had a major expansion of primary education about 20 years ago, and they did that by recruiting teachers who had, I think, a minimum of 9th grade completed. So what are the linguistic issues in education, not only among children, but also among teachers? What they wanted to do, the intervention, was they wanted to train teachers both to be able to control Malagasy official better, but also to find strategies to use the local varieties in the teaching of standard Malgache. There was no space for using those varieties in writing and so on. Well, apart from maybe putting them in some materials in a corner and letting the children look at them, but not during class time. So they were operating within restrictions, but trying to address these issues. And these are two of the poorest provinces of the country, especially Andrui, right at the bottom. So they were really looking for a study to say teachers don't really speak Malgache very well, so we need to address that. That was the purpose of the study. We also learned about teachers' attitudes towards language issues. So just in the two provinces, we overall interviewed 352 teachers, sorry. There was some security issues, couldn't go some places, and there was flooding. There were some of the enumerators sending me pictures of them surrounded by water. It's like, heroes, really. And then in Andrui, the even poorer province, they didn't have such, they have very little rain, so they didn't have flooding. 327 teachers. Now, I think up to 10 teachers per school. Some schools had one teacher. And some schools were little bits of wood that looked like it was a shelter for animals. So we did 4 tests on the teachers. We did a written comprehension. We did an oral comprehension. These were leveled, the oral comprehension for 2nd grade children. We also did a grammar test, which is probably less important, but it was just seeing what's their meta-linguistic knowledge. And then we also tested them with a listening comprehension in one of the local varieties. Actually getting hold of those texts and leveling them was almost impossible. So the comparison wasn't as good as I would have hoped. But we did manage to do that. And generally, the comprehension test results for the official language were actually weaker than expected, especially given that the text was leveled for 2nd grade children. Now, there are different categories. FRAM teachers, and that's an acronym from Malgache, basically are those without a secondary school certificate. That it's slightly more, and they're about 72% of teachers. Unsurprisingly, those who'd finished secondary school had a better command of Malagasy than those who didn't have it. And we found much better results among teachers in towns, but the towns represent less than 10% of the population. Here's what the average scores were in the two provinces. We reckon that you should really be getting at least 7 out of 10 correct if you're a teacher for a basic text, but we weren't. We were getting some scores as low as 4 as an average. The results are, but the thing was actually the scores were higher in the local varieties, but not as much as we would have expected. So some people were probably just having a bad day. So that's our range. We had everything possible. The grammar is only the maximum you could get was 6. So it's not, yeah, we could have. So you had some people getting everything right, some people getting nothing. Probably also having a bad day. But a very large range of results. Overall, the scores were statistically significantly better for listening to the local varieties than Malagasy Oficial. And we need to take into account those texts weren't leveled. They were recorded on phones the day before we started doing the research, as opposed to being professionally produced in studios and so on. So they weren't as good. So the fact that it's not as, that's my mitigation, but still the results weren't as clear as they were statistically significant, but still if they're statistically significant and not very big, it doesn't indicate that's a major finding. But we found there was a language issue among students. We were interested in were teachers local. By the way, the only area where we found local and national scores were similar was an area where we didn't actually have the text in that local dialect. So again, that is consistent with this being, you know, they do speak the local language much better. We kind of knew this, but sometimes you need to demonstrate what you know. And those are the 3 varieties at the top that were we had texts in. Andrui, everyone claims they speak Antandrui, the local variety, whereas there are far more varieties. And how much those are really different linguistic labels and how much they're clan labels, we don't know. No one would give we haven't got that data. Significant differences, but say Antifas and Antisac, they drop the final vowels, in case you're wondering about my pronunciation, are more similar to each other than they are to Antandrui. But then you didn't, and then Antifas and Antisac are from the same province. So this was what was the strategy? And the thing that was then done with this research was to justify the use of methodology called linguistic transfer. And here I'm getting out of my comfort zone. I'm a sociolinguist, and this is pedagogy. But sometimes, so all teachers would use the local varieties in the classroom because the children didn't understand, but they had never been taught how to make the best of them. So part of the training is how to maybe explain to the children in the local variety and then introduce, once they've understood, the terminology in the standard language. This training is ongoing. I heard from someone last week, they were in a training workshop training teachers doing this kind of thing. So the goal is actually the better teaching of Malagasy Oficial. And also to train the teachers. And they found some similar people who were involved in Madagascar, also involved in DRC, that they could actually improve teachers' performance in French with just a few weeks. If they had a bit, they could build it up. And that's what they're hoping to do with Malagasy here in this case as well. This is a slide that was used. It's in French, the sandwich method, which basically you start off in a mix of varieties, let the students speak whatever language or terms they want to use. Understanding is the key. Explain it in the local variety, and then continue with the target language, the Malgache official. So it's a way of leveraging the local varieties while helping the students to learn the standard language better. Okay, so it's going around. Okay. Oh, so this I think I was planning to change this slide. My apologies. So in the Gambia, what were the questions? Optimal language for instruction was the question in Gambia. So we looked at the children's and teachers' full repertoires. Personally, I'm very happy with that study. I thought it was the right, I'm not saying it, the others are wrong, but we were able to do a great in-depth study of what's going on in the schools of the Gambia. In DRC, it was more restricted, testing are the national languages understood by children and teachers? Yes, by teachers, variably by children. And Madagascar, looking really to demonstrate that this is a problem. Of course, the educational ministry is far away, funnily enough, in the place where they speak the official language. And people often think, well, everyone knows the standard language. So it was a way of really demonstrating there's a need to do this. And so we tested teachers' linguistic competence in that. And I think my question to you, I'm sure, well, you might well have various questions, but what I said at the beginning, what differences do you see between these contexts described? And they're different from each other and those that you are familiar with. And are there any helpful insights which could be adapted to your context? Thank you. Oh, I've taken all my time, sorry.
Thank you very much. Well, very impressive, very variety and very interesting. And even if we compare to content in Thailand, I think in Africa, even more complicated. For next, do anyone like to answer to the two questions?
Or another question is fine as well. Sure.
So the context I've mostly worked in is international schools, and I worked a lot with little ones, like kindergarten ages 4 to 5. And it's interesting how you talk about these kids speaking multiple languages, because what issue I run into is more kids speak one language, but it's not the same. Right. And a lot of times, because of their age, parents will just bring them and be like, this is my child. He speaks Hebrew. He's never been to school before. Good luck. This is my child. She speaks Russian. She's never been to school before. Good luck. And then I get these kids just kind of thrown at me. And then the school, of course, is like, well, you're teaching English. They need to be literate. They have to do this, this, and this by the time they finish a year with you. And so yeah, it's a very different issue. But when you were talking about, like, do you teach in one language? Do you let them use whatever language? I kind of did a lot of everything, because it seemed like every day is like, I'm putting out new fires. I'm trying to figure out what works today. And so little ones that age pick up language very fast. My language in the classroom was always in English, but I kept it very simple and was highly repetitive. So we had a song for every activity. And the kids knew, even before they knew the words of the song, if teacher Sarah is singing this song, we need to go to our tables. If teacher Sarah is singing this song, we need to get our pencils. And it helped the kids who couldn't speak the language figure it out. And then as I had more kids come in, so I have a new kid with Russian, the other Russian kids would be like, oh, go get your pencil. That's what this song means, go get your pencil. And I would use Google Translate. I would look up like phrases and words to play for kids, especially when they first came to my classroom. A common phrase was, teacher loves you, you are safe. And I would just play for it over and over and over for them until they felt like they would be okay. But yeah, I also thought it was interesting what you're talking about, how we can't really just view people as being monolingual, because a lot of these kids, yes, they had their home language, but I'm trying to teach them a second one. And I would go a little bit crazy, because over the years, I've seen so many teachers like, no, they can't use this language. They can't use that language. It's like, but that's the language that they know. And if the language they know is going to connect into the language that I'm trying to teach them, fabulous. If you can use your language to explain to your friend what's going on, and they can integrate with the classroom and participate and be engaged, that's great. I love that. But yeah, no, I'm fascinated by Africa. But anyways, my question was this. So my thesis for my PhD, I'm going to be doing classroom observations of language use. And I was just wondering how I'm still in the beginning stages of my thesis, but it seems a bit nebulous at this point. How did you take notes? Did you make recordings? How did you make the observations? And then how did you make sense of your observations?
One issue, I think, an added level of complexity that it sounds like that you have is that children are coming in from a totally different context, whereas these children will already have been living in their communities and playing with other children. And maybe it's a different language from all they heard from their parents, but they've already been working on learning languages before they're coming into school. So I think that's, when you have a child who suddenly arrives from Russia or wherever, that is, and they haven't been in the same speech community. And so they're introduced from outside. So I think that's this, in comparison, this context is probably less challenging. I'm not saying it's not challenging. The observations, we didn't do recordings. We asked enumerators to make multiple observations, just which language are you hearing? I also asked them in case, because people don't necessarily just speak one language at a time. There's some mixing and people talk of translanguaging and code switching and so on. And I would actually get them, rather than to analyze, to actually write down examples that you could then look at, because sometimes, sometimes in initial training, you'd go, oh, this isn't Swahili, it's got French words in it. But I said, no, try and identify the main language. And if you're not sure, just write some examples. Often words like pen or something were borrowed from the language of education. So it'd be stilo, but that doesn't make it French. They're still probably speaking Swahili. But you could do those quite quickly. And they had their tablets, and they could, playing on their tablet while being near children doesn't look that strange. Very stranger to be writing on a piece of paper. And one of the things we did was make multiple observations. So sometimes when you look at data, you go, this doesn't look right. There was one school where it looked like people hadn't really done it. But everywhere else, there was enough, the data made sense. There was one where it was really multiple observations, getting people to work in pairs so that one person that was talking could do the talking, the other person could take notes, and so on. I think we've got a question online.
I have also answer and question.
Okay.
In Thai context, in school, students who use other minority language, not Central Thai language, are discriminated.
Right.
Yes. In the Gambia case, there are 3 languages that quite equal group of people uses. Are they discriminate each other, or?
I didn't hear about that very much, actually, and I imagine it would have come out more if it were a big issue, but I don't know. But the way people talked, there seemed, I in some ways maybe less than I might have expected. But I mean, by all means, it's something we should be open to looking at. And I find it strange because the Gambia is now a functioning democracy, but 10, 15 years ago was a very traumatic regime for some people. But it wasn't really ethnic based. So yeah, that's not a theme that I really heard, interestingly. And no one is a majority. And yes, there are some small groups, but as I mentioned, the Manjak are probably one of the more prosperous and definitely one of the most educated groups, and they're one of the smallest. So we found in the Manjak schools, all the teachers were Manjaks, but there were lots of Manjaks elsewhere. So yeah, it's a good question. My feeling is, and maybe I sound like I'm just in love with the Gambia, is that didn't seem to be such a big issue as in many places. Maybe I've got rose-colored spectacles, I don't know. The online question from Brian.
Hello.
Can we hear you?
Okay.
Here's Brian. Yes, we see him.
You can ask questions.
All right.
We will be able to hear in the meeting where.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
okay.
think we can,
Yeah, you
we
can
can hear
ask.
you. We can hear you, Brian. I think. Yeah.
All right. Great. Professor Gibson, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I'll be very brief. So currently, Southeast Asian countries, we are in the process of drafting and even finalizing a roadmap on multilingual education in Southeast Asia. And one of the recommendations in the roadmap, and I think Kirk later on can update you on that, would be to do this school language mapping in every countries. And I'm really interested on your research on how you, both of the methodologies in Democratic Republic of Congo and Gambia was observation and interviews, right? So I was wondering whether that will be the best way to do the school mapping, the school language mapping, because basically in Southeast Asia, if we wanted to do that, it will be a massive works. so I was wondering whether this is
so in the Gambia, the request from ministry was that we went into every single school, of which are just over 600. The population is just over 2.5 million. I realize, that was a luxury, but was probably necessary because you couldn't identify the zones, and that was, whereas in DRC we took a sample. We weren't going into every school, and yes, you can. I feel one of the things you don't know when you are asking teachers is how reliable their data is. Now, actually, in both the Gambia and the DRC, we found that what the teachers said was happening was a very close match with what we observed. Sometimes in some places where there's more ethnic tension, that might not be the case. But I think you can only really discover if you do a bit of both. So what I would recommend generally is, because you can do surveys of teachers probably much more cheaply, even online and so on, or if they come for a training event, you can then talk to them in one place, and then you don't have to. So I would recommend doing those areas who are really not sure what's going on, maybe try and send some enumerators to such spaces, and also interview teachers and see how well those two sets of data match. And again, you don't need to do everything. You find a sample. The problem with a sample is often with sampling, even if you officially choose a random sample, the schools which are the hardest to reach, you will get to the least. And they are the ones where there's most likely to be linguistic diversity. So my recommendation is almost to oversample those ones. But yeah, you can use sampling, and then I think then doing something like online surveys with teachers rather than head teachers. Yeah, don't use head teachers. That's one of my advice. They've got other things on their mind. Or do interviews while they're at a training event or something. That would be my initial response, because yes, I mean, you can't go to every school in a country like Thailand or somewhere, unless, you know, the amount of money that would cost would be astronomical.
Thank you, Professor Gibson.
Yeah, kind of, yeah, thinking about that, like I wondered, like in the DRC with the sampling, then if from the sampling, maybe you could derive like a typology, like we see these three situations happening most often, and then expand that to questionnaires for teachers or something to see, you know, what feels most similar to your school or something. Yeah.
Yes, and also there are things that we as sociolinguists know. You tend to get different patterns in towns from countryside. You tend to get more the incoming languages if you have a major road. That is, you know, there's solid studies showing that kind of thing. There are some other surprising findings that actually lots of languages and environment don't lead to high levels of loss. That actually leads to strong levels of maintenance of languages. On average, there are lots of local variations. So there are some things where in designing something, I would say I would make sure I tended, in DRC, I actually deliberately didn't choose a totally random sample because urban contexts, sampling sevens, it's possible you'd have different things in different parts of town, but generally whenever we've done this, you go into the town. Actually, Gambia is an exception. There were parts of town which were Mandinka dominant rather than Wolof dominant. In the Congo, there was a town language. I was some ways more interested in what's going on in the countryside and the places difficult to get to, and the in-between spaces. So I would see towns, major roads, off major roads as my three categories to make sure you were covering. And then areas where communities are mixing, what's happening there? If you have two minority communities in the same space or more.
Like you were saying, the places that are hardest to go to, people visit the least. But then, or maybe because here in Southeast Asia, we do have lots of national testing and things like that in places. Maybe start with the places that have the lowest scores,
definitely,
where the students are obviously doing the worst.
I mean, I actually said in my report, you will find lower reading scores in these areas. And I haven't seen the reading scores. And then they went, oh, yes, you're right. But we tried, this area has always been difficult.
Yes.
You know, to me, it's obvious. You're teaching them in the wrong language. But people don't always see that.
Well, this is so exciting.
Judgmental of me. There you go.
So this is so exciting because what Brian was talking about is an effort, the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, which is it, Brian, is it 10 or 11 countries that are cooperating and looking
11,
at this happen? And one of the 6 tracks is to do more school language mapping in those places.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's very inspiring and comparative between African countries. I also did the same research in Nigeria. So, and in Nigeria, you know that there are over hundreds of tribes, and specifically schools are very segregated by ethnic groups: Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, whatever. And I really like the sandwich methodology, and then in the Madagascar, that country. So based on that methodology, that there needs to be a lot of resources to supporting teachers, you know, to use the multi-language in one classroom to ensure all students. So did you find any, like, is there that the government or policymakers supporting that kind of that methodology, or providing the resources or teachers to ensure that students, they learn their mother tongue languages in one classrooms? Because of, you know, most of the African countries, they're very poorly, you know, the education system not supported. And then even like I remember in Abuja, the 75 students in one class, even they don't have a chair to sit in the class. So in the capital of the country. So just wondering, that kind of methodology is even not, you know, supported in United States or, you know, or European countries. That kind of like resources needs to be, you know, provided to teachers to kind of use the methodology.
And I think that was one of the, I mean, I'm kind of going off a slight tangent to start with, but in the Gambia, one of the reasons I think that the trying to find one language for school was a reasonable thing is you might be able to do it if like the one school where I showed you the pictures, I think they tried to do 6 languages and they'd ended up giving up. And that was probably one of the best resourced schools in the country. It was just too complicated. So
how about segregation, like between ethnic groups? Does government really try to bring all ethnic groups in under one umbrella, or every, because of the rich people, they send their kids to the private schools.
yeah.
So how about the public schools through that diversity and inclusion, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the Gambia, it's massively mixed. I mean, the figures you'd get from almost every school had at least 10% children from another ethnicity. There were 1 or 2 by self-report. It was interesting, by the way, when we asked children, which language do you speak or languages, it was quite clear in some schools, they were kind of presented, you could only choose one because the numbers in the class matched the number. Whereas we were actually looking for, put your hand up twice if you speak 2 languages. And it looks like some enumerators did that differently. But yes, in the Gambia, great ethnic diversity and linguistic diversity. In Congo, we weren't looking at the local languages. So we, well, if the children were speaking them, we recorded that. Because that showed that the national language wasn't the dominant language in that community. In Madagascar, it's quite interesting, that whole thing with the sandwich methodology. I actually presented that to some quite senior officials in the Ministry of Education, one of whom got very excited. And apparently she'd been quite opposed beforehand. Sometimes, people hear things 3 or 4 times and then suddenly it clicks. They're doing quite a lot of training at the moment, but then they've got support from USAID. And I think that the thing is trying to show that this can work in 2 provinces to then encourage it to happen in other places. Yes, it's a real issue, but the changes that we might recommend have to be ones that can be done. And that is a challenge. I'd be interested in finding out more about what your experiences in Nigeria.
Specifically, my research was in compared to public schools and then private schools. It's totally different and how they implement multicultural principles in the curriculum, and the religion clashes, ethnic clashes, and then we have, my research was 2010. It's basically my dissertation. So, but probably a little bit thing has been changed, but there are too much clashes between ethnic groups, and teachers are poorly not supported by the government. And
yeah, I mean, I said we went into every primary school. That's not true. We went into every state primary school. We didn't go into private schools because they don't follow the curriculum.
Yeah, I did.
So there's sorry. Yeah, I realized I actually slightly misread, and we'd expect more English in those. Interestingly, there was only 1 school where the teachers said, no need for the national language program. The children speak English. Only 1 school. And there is a community in the capital who speak an English-based Creole, which wasn't the dominant language in any of the schools. It's not, unlike other countries where that becomes a thing that different communities use to speak with each other, not the case in the Gambia. It's only used within that community. They're a pretty prosperous community, and I probably send most of their children to private schools in English and probably wouldn't want them taught in Creole. But we didn't interview them. We had a bunch of teachers from that community. But anyway,
great, thank you.
Professor, we have a question from online. Dr. Sitishet, would you like to ask the question, or would you like me to read your comment?
Okay. Hello, Professor Gibson. I post online, and actually my work is about multilingual class. Especially my student is monk, and they have to study Pali, Sanskrit, and as the standard of Thai students, they must pass the English language, and we also provide the other language like Khmer and Hindi as well. So they study a lot of languages, and how can we improve it together with actually we use Thai in class. Another is we have to push them to the satisfactory level. Like for English, they must be at B1 level, for example. Actually, my research is working on the typological of non-final verb, that I think is quite cognitive linguistic, that they have to transfer from L1 or the L2 to L3, anything else. I wonder how can I design the materials and assess the like, do we is it sure to assess their knowledge and their ability in other language like that? Yeah, sorry. Do
Okay.
you understand?
I mean, I can see there are obviously some particular challenges in your context as well. I mean, when I studied Latin at school, we never developed any communicative proficiency because, you know, it's a language well, in theory, there are ways of practicing it, but we very much learn from the books. And I wonder if in your case, I don't know, with Pali and Sanskrit, are they working? Another factor I imagine would be they're mainly working with those languages from texts rather than in conversation and so on. Is that the case?
Actually, they are not. They don't use as the conversation, but we have the conversation subject as well. But they don't use in daily life, so that's it's quite far from what we call L1 or L2. Yeah, and then and it's just like you learn Latin and you don't speak it every day in daily life. So that's why they can be improved to the standard level like that.
Yeah, and there are particular challenges there. Obviously, people do and can learn those languages, but the way we learn them is quite different. I mean, one of the things we talked about for Madagascar was trying to give comprehensible input. That's the key. That's how we learn our normal. We all successfully learn languages. You know, we're all here, but we do that. You know, we learn our first language and often a second language, not by studying it in a book, but by being surrounded by it and interpreting messages in it. And it sounds like what you were talking about in the international school. You try to leverage that kind of thing. You make things, put them in context so they're understandable. Now, that methodology can be used with languages which are not spoken in conversation, but it takes a very skilled teacher to do so. And often the goal might be to read texts or to say prayers and so on, which isn't impossible, but it's just a bigger challenge. You know, I can't say I speak Latin. I studied it for 5 years at secondary school. It is intrinsically, there are, you know, you're looking at typological issues as well. I think that's really interesting. But just the fact that, you know, maybe, I mean, I know people have done for some no longer actively spoken languages, set up environments where people use those languages. It's possible to do that, but again, it's a lot of work. It's not, I'm not trying to discourage that, but it would require looking at language learning and language teaching methodology in depth, and then enabling people to get into those. I don't know if I'm quite answering your question, but that's my first hunch, is that the nature of the way the languages are used, more than the languages themselves, is probably one of the big challenges with getting people to learn them well.
So actually, there are some society, also some community, like when we are going to the seminar in Sri Lanka, they use only Pali in this conference, for example.
Okay.
And even in Sanskrit conference, they also provide Sanskrit as well.
Okay. And does that work? I'm getting.
Only the scholars, but not my students. Actually,
Okay.
they can understand even English. Actually, yeah.
Right.
That's the. Actually, we know that even Thai students who graduate the 9th grade of Pariyantam, we call Pariyantam, so they can speak in daily life like the monk in Sri Lanka. So this is the way that we try to make the environment to be like normal use of language like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we also provide the subject of conversation as well.
Okay. That sounds like a really good strategy. Actually, it does take careful planning, but it sounds like it could be a productive methodology. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I think.
Thank you. It's a really interesting question. I haven't really thought about much before.
Yeah, and I do agree with you. But that's when we use a language, we have to use it actually. Yeah. So when we learn only from book, it can be worked. So for example, I studied Chinese at very beginning. I only remember the graphic, the choreographic of it, but after that I can't even speak it.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it is a good time, and everybody have discussed fruitfully. Thank you for joining us, our room and online, and thank you, Dr. Maik, for very, very impressive topic today. Hopefully, we would like to have you again here for visiting or for join us other work in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege to be able to be with you.